Welcome, everybody, to the Body, Soul, and Spirit podcast. Once again, it's so joyful to just come to you guys this week and dive in to a topic that we spoke about in our last podcast segment. And we talked about agency and the power of agency. We defined it, and I highly recommend that you listen to that podcast if you haven't done so you familiarize yourself with the word agency. I gave you guys a little bit of my background and the lack of agency that I had in my life, which led me to a lot of spiritual names. But there was such a disconnect between what was happening internally and what was happening externally because I didn't really have a language to that. I didn't know what agency was. Very important topic. And if we look at it from a biblical perspective, we can find the word agency is basically out of Proverbs 4:23. It says, guard your heart with all diligence, for from it flows the issues of life. One translation says, for from it flows the springs of life. So it talks to us about keeping the heart with all diligence, because that's where our heart is the place where all the issues of life come forth. If our heart is not guarded, then many things and many issues of life begin to penetrate it. And when you look back at your life in retrospect, you can see that throughout your seasons of life, things penetrated our hearts. Things like unforgiveness can penetrate the heart. Things like sadness can penetrate the heart. And so we're given this powerful scripture in Proverbs 4:23. It says, above everything, before you do anything, really guard your heart. Like we're supposed to be these guards. We're supposed to be these guards that stand at attention, if you will, guarding our heart, what comes in and what goes out. He's saying above everything with all diligence, like whatever you do above everything, just be the guard of your heart. You monitor, you regulate what comes in and what goes out. Now, a lot of times when you look at that scripture, we fail to really keep that at the forefront of our mind. And we just sometimes let things come in without a conscious mind, without realizing it, without giving it a second thought. We just allow things to penetrate the heart. Before you know it, because things penetrated our heart, now we start to produce certain kinds of fruit. Now, in my own personal life, I had a lot of lack of agency, and I knew God. I had Jesus in my heart. I really was living for him. I was all in. My heart was sold out for God. I wanted to serve him. At the age of 16 years old, I made that full commitment. It wasn't like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Like I literally had this incredible encounter with God, but I didn't have agency. It was like I really wasn't being a good guard of my heart. I wasn't really keeping with all diligence, keeping guard over my heart. And so I had no agency. And as a result, I started to give spiritual names such as sacrifice, like we are supposed to be a living sacrifice. And we didn't really have agency. So when we start to put spiritual names to like sacrifice, dying to ourselves, but we have no agency, it could really become messy. It could really become just a spiritual name that we've given it, but we're really not seeing an internal growth. So I defined agency. Agency includes the ability to regulate one's own thoughts, one's own feelings, and one's own behavior. And I didn't really have anybody teaching me that up until, as I shared my story, until I started to really dive into getting really healed from a lot of the traumas that I had encountered during my seasons of hardship in my life. So agency is being able to regulate your own thoughts, your own feelings, and your own behaviors. So let's take, for example, somebody who walks with God and they have no agency, but they're saying things like, I'm called to sacrifice my life, or I am called to die to my flesh, but you really don't know or don't have the ability to regulate your own thoughts. So your thoughts are everywhere. Your emotions haven't been regulated, and there's a lot of immaturity emotionally, which leads you to certain behaviors that you probably don't even like about yourself. And we're given, oh, well, I'm supposed to die to myself. And that can just really become incongruent to what God wants for our lives. And it can become a deformed concept of death to self, a deformed concept, until we start to point out certain things, right? Until we start to go, okay, wait, here I'm sacrificing, but boy, do I have an anger issue. And it is just incongruent. When Jesus steps into our lives, God steps in, God doesn't step in to cancel our own humanity. God doesn't come in to cancel that human side of us. And because of a lack of agency, there's a lot of deformity, a lot of dysfunction. And we call things like, I'm just very discerning, when in fact, it's not discerning because of the lack of agency. You're very judgmental. Or we start to say things like, wow, the Lord showed me. But in reality, because of the lack of agency, we point out everybody's flaws and we don't take the log out of our own eyes. So agency is being emotionally healthy and very self-aware. And that's very important in our lives. So when you look at agency, Jesus is a perfect example of who gave up his agency. He had very strong agency. He was very aware of himself. He didn't sugarcoat, didn't put spiritual names to anything. And so he's our great example. Jesus, he actually gave up his agency, right? He could have come down from the cross, but there was just such a beauty that was set before him. It says that because of the joy that was set before him. So he would look at humanity and he thought, I'm just going to give up this agency for the sake of just saving everybody. And so he really showed us a perfect example of what it is to die to ourselves, but have agency at the same time. And if I were to define that in perspective of agency, where we are not just putting some spiritual name to it, or a label and it's deformed, but rather, what does it look like to die to ourselves, but yet still have agency? I'll define it. When you die to yourself and you have agency, it's really a joy of spiritual formation to look more and more like him. And so you're working towards looking more and more like Jesus daily. And that really is, in psychology, we call it that agency, but it really gives you this ability to just go, there's such a joy in this formation. There's such a joy in being formed more and more like Christ. And this is something that, not that I lacked because I wanted to be more like him, but I wasn't very aware of certain aspects in my life. And I think because there was such a lack of agency. So we talked a little bit about how to develop agency, and we're going to continue that in this podcast today. Agency, again, it refers to feelings and this ability to be able to regulate. Last week I said control your own actions and choices. It's kind of like you have a sense of a regulation. Your anger is not just everywhere. Your sadness is not just overtaking you, but you can make healthy decisions, take action. There's a very strong sense of agency. I run across sometimes situations where somebody who doesn't have a strong sense of agency, for instance, and they say there's a lot of excuses sometimes in the heart. And because of a lack of agency, there's not a lot of awareness where we're really making excuses for the right decisions that we have to make. Sometimes we lack that consistency. Sometimes we lack that ability to discipline our lives when we should be saying yes. We keep saying no, or we make excuses. And that's oftentimes it's a lack of agency. So how do we develop agency? Because that really involves a cultivating. You cultivate a belief in your own capacity the things that are influencing your life. You take responsibility for your own choices. You're very much aware of what's influencing your life. That's important because to develop agency, you're going to have to be very aware of what you are cultivating. What kind of thoughts are you cultivating? What kind of emotions are you cultivating? What kind of decisions are you cultivating? What kind of choices are you cultivating? That's important. So we talked about developing agency. I said last week, we have to identify and challenge those limiting beliefs. If you're going to develop agency, you're going to have to identify all of your limited beliefs, the things that you have said about yourself that are holding you back, that are keeping you powerless, that don't allow you to take action. Somebody with agency begins to challenge them. They don't just let thoughts just run rampant in their mind. I said also to develop agency, you have to set clear goals and take action. You have to be a person of action. You can't say, I'll do it tomorrow, but rather you really start to manage even small goals. Sometimes those small goals may seem like they're insignificant, but in reality, those small goals, those small steps, taking control of your life now where you're saying, I'm no longer going to live this way, I'm going to live that way. Let's say a goal might be for you to get out of debt. And rather than continue to spend and overspend, you start to make measurable goals towards those goals that you have set for your finances. Same thing for maybe your spiritual walk. Maybe you said, I don't pray anymore. And you say, I need to establish those goals in my life and, and cultivate that discipline in my life. So you start to make measurable goals and you say, I'm going to allow this time for my prayer time and just have some time with God. So you start to take action. Somebody who has agencies takes action. They don't just talk the talk, but they actually walk it. Another one is you start to develop self-efficacy, and it's really a type of building confidence in your own abilities. And to do that, you start to practice new skills. You seek out feedback. And then you also know how to celebrate your successes. That's self-efficacy, where you start to build this confidence because you practice new skills. You seek that feedback from other people and you refine those areas that need to be refined that don't look like Jesus. And then you also are able to celebrate those small successes. That is self-efficacy. And that's important. That is very much needed in our lives to be able to begin to develop that agency. Another example of developing agency would be to practice your self-reflection and really regularly evaluate your own experiences. What areas, and identify what areas need improvement. And you learn from both the successes and you learn from the failures. And you're not hard on yourself because you failed, but rather you take forward action in regards to those failures. You don't sit and sulk over the failure, but you learn from it. Somebody with agency would do an evaluation, so to speak, every once in a while of the experiences, say your relationships, your involvement in ministry, your involvement in serving God. What does your spiritual life look like? What does your emotional life look like? That is self-reflection, and you do a practice of that. Somebody who is developing agency, you start to practice that self-reflection. Sometimes people don't like to practice self-reflection because it might be painful. They don't like themselves. There's self-hatred. They're hard on themselves. And I think I lacked a lot of the self-agency because I didn't like to look at my own flaws. It was hard to look at because I was very hard on myself. So I think that was an area where I had to start to practice and just evaluate those experiences. See, when I didn't have agency, but I had spirituality, I would look at the failure, and rather than learning from it and practicing that self-reflection and learning from that experience and to go, what can I have done different? What can I learn from that experience? What was happening in my life, I had the spirituality, but to look at that failure just became a self-critic. And when you have agency, you don't look at yourself from that lens. You're actually looking at yourself from the lens of, what can I learn from this failure? And it doesn't really get rooted into your identity. And I think that sometimes was happening to me, where it would get really seated and rooted into my identity. So I thought there was a flaw in my life when in fact it should have been just self-reflection. So somebody with agency starts to practice that self-reflection. Another one is you cultivate resilience. That's really important. Somebody with a development of agency is you cultivate the resilience. You just develop this ability to be able to bounce back from setbacks. You can bounce back from the challenge. You can bounce back and understand that failure is part of a learning process. And that took me some time, to be quite frank. Now, I've always had this sense of resilience. I think God built me in a way where there is a very strong sense of resilience. So I had that. But there were some areas in my life it was really hard to come back from. Coming back from a setback doesn't mean that you are just moving on. I see sometimes people are going, yeah, I've got resilience. I move forward, and I'm no longer set back and I'm better. But in reality, at the heart, there's still a sense of bitterness. There's still a sense of resentment. So when I say cultivate resilience, it's not just that you're still here. It's not that you're still at church, or it's not that, all those people are my enemies, and I have now rebranded myself, so to speak, and all is well. No, when I talk about resilience, I think I've got to be careful there, because you make it a part of your learning process, and there is no bitterness in it. There is no unforgiveness in there. There's no need to go and state all of your case. You can walk away from maybe really difficult situations and really own and take responsibility for your choices. Somebody with agency doesn't sit there and then bash other people, and just go, it's your fault, and now I'm better because of this. You don't have to state your case. You don't have to get on Google and bash everybody. And somebody with agency doesn't need to do that. They're resilient, and they learn, and they take responsibility for their own actions, and they don't put the blame on other people. So that's a good gauge. So whenever you see somebody and they're just bashing other people, and they're just like, yeah, and their eyes are other people, it's like, well, that doesn't really look like resilience. That looks like still some bitterness that needs to be worked out. Let me give you two more. Another way to develop agency is to seek support and to seek some connection. You cannot develop agency by yourself. So this bit of isolation, this bit of just me and God, it doesn't suit well with somebody who is going to develop agency. There has to be a surrounding of yourself with very supportive people that can cultivate healthy relationships, that can provide guidance, that can provide encouragement, that can steer you in a direction where if there's areas that doesn't look like Jesus, then they're able to give you that support, that feedback. And somebody with agency can really embrace that. It's not everybody's fault. It's the church's fault. It's their fault. And now I'm a better person. No. You really can seek some support, some kind of connection. You're really at peace with that. You're comfortable sharing. You can open up your heart to other people. You're open to that correction. You're open to that feedback. That's very, very key. Another person that says, I choose to develop agency, you'll find that they really know how to take care of themselves. They seek mental health. And I think that this is where we need to break a lot of the stigmas around mental health, because they know somebody with agency starts to take care of their physical body. They start to take care of their mental well-being. They start to take care of themselves. They start making choices and taking action that now doesn't hinder their well-being. I could probably say that this is probably an area where I lacked, and it was very self-sacrificial, so to speak. But in reality, I wasn't really taking care of myself. And I felt guilty for that. Sometimes people feel guilty for taking care of themselves. It's almost like I have to just die to myself. And that's rooted in a lot of other areas. But somebody with self-agency really starts to take care of their spiritual walk. They are now maturing towards taking care of that relationship with God. And you prioritize that. You don't neglect it. You don't neglect your mental health. You don't neglect your emotional health. That goes for females. That goes for males as well. Another way to develop agency is to focus on your strengths. Look at your strengths. What are your talents? And then you start to move towards those strengths and really cultivate them. Somebody with agency really embraces challenges and opportunities. They take on new challenges. They take on new opportunities for growth and for learning. They don't stay stuck. They don't conform, but they're people that really shatter ceilings. Another way to develop agency is to be very mindful, become very aware of your thoughts, of your feelings, of your behaviors, and making conscious choices of those thoughts, of those feelings, and those behaviors. And if they're very incongruent to, let's say, the Word of God, they're very incongruent to how Jesus sees you, then somebody with agency or somebody who's developing that agency will be very mindful of that. They're not ignoring their thoughts. They don't pretend. I don't know if you've ever met somebody who kind of pretends to be something they're not, and they only give you one face because they really just cannot accept that human side of them. That's so dangerous. I think somebody who's got strong agency and is developing it, they're very mindful. They can see their weaknesses. They recognize that they have some work to do in that area. They're not hard on themselves as a result of it, but they're mindful of their thoughts. They're mindful of their feelings, and they're mindful of those behaviors that maybe need to change, but they're very conscious of that. And lastly, there's somebody who's developing agency, tries to minimize as much distraction from negative influences around them. Somebody who is developing agency doesn't have time for social media drama, doesn't have time to be distracted, but they really keep that at a minimum. There's negative influences, obviously, that can influence your environment. They can influence your thoughts. They can influence your feelings. And as a result, things get into the heart. Social media can be one of those platforms where we have to regulate. Negative relationships would be another one. They really are not empowering you. Notice that when you get around them, they almost feel like they set you back. You watch something, heard something, and you know it's really enemy-based because it became a distraction. It became a negative influence. And instead of pushing you forward, it pushed you back. It set you back. Like, I think one of the scriptures that comes to mind is Paul, and he really tells the Galatian church, like, what happened to you guys? Like, who intercepted? Because you guys were running such a good race. You were doing good. You started in the spirit, now you're ending in the flesh. So somebody who develops agency is somebody who minimizes that in their lives. They recognize this has been a big distraction. This is really negative. It is not good for me. It is a negative influence. I noticed that after I watched that, it didn't lead me to become more like Jesus. It actually led me to begin to question the very thing that I was so certain about. So that's important to look at. And when you see that, it's something to ask yourself when you're developing that agency. Is like, why did it get me off track? Like, for instance, you watch something on social media, it may affect you and it didn't affect somebody else. Something to ask as you develop that agency is like, why did it affect me and it didn't affect the other person? What about me? What seed is in my heart that triggered that? What is in my heart that maybe I need to uproot? Because there's maybe a root there that needs to be worked on. Maybe you're not fully convinced. And because now you had that negative influence, now it could be rooted in your heart. So that's important, because think about this: like spirits attract like spirits. So somebody with agency recognizes they don't really have time for all that drama. You start to minimize those distractions, those negative influences as you start to develop that agency. And lastly, to develop that agency, it's a person who starts to express a need for boundary. Now, this is where I failed miserably, and I haven't really mastered it fully, but I can say it's almost like a boundaries that are just so getting crossed in your life. You don't really know how to advocate for yourself. So somebody who starts to develop agency starts to advocate for themselves. They're able to express, no, this is my boundary, and you're assertive about it. You're not mean, you're just assertive. You're not afraid to speak up for your needs. You're not afraid to speak up for maybe a boundary that has been crossed. Somebody's trying to make a decision for you. I think I was not very good at this. I think it was very fear-based. I didn't know. I had a lot of spirituality, but I lacked agency in this area. I didn't really know how to advocate for myself. I felt maybe guilty. If I advocated for myself, I felt maybe like I wasn't dying to myself if I didn't advocate for myself. Or I was afraid of what other people were going to think of me if I didn't advocate for myself. So that somebody with agency and somebody who starts to develop agency now is able to express that without any guilt, and you start to become very assertive about it. So these are some examples of how to develop agency. You might have to maybe listen to this again and just kind of really identify those areas. I probably named about 12, but those areas that could help you start to now develop an agency in your life. So now you're not just putting spiritual names, and these spiritual names that we've given them and its definitions, they don't have to be deformed. So now we can really have agency, but at the same time be spiritual. And that is so empowering. So you might have to listen to this again, but I want to challenge you this week. If there's an area in your life where you're maybe lacking some agency, this would be a really good week to start to practice that as you start to develop agency in your life, start to cultivate it, and let's just have that strong agency as Jesus did. So I challenge you this week, if you are lacking some agency, you're going, wow, I really don't do that well. That's okay. Give yourself some grace. This is a good week to begin to practice it and develop it. So we'll see you guys next time.